Shana Tova. There's a wonderful story about a great pianist. He was a featured soloist in this concert, and he was playing a very complex Beethoven sonata. In the middle of the piece, the lights in the concert hall go out. There's a power outage in the auditorium. A gasp comes from the audience, and then through the darkness, the music continues to flow. The brilliant, intricate sounds of the sonata seem to resonate more loudly in the hall. When the pianist completes the piece, the silence is deafening. After a long moment, the theater erupts into heartfelt, thunderous applause. After he comes off the stage, the pianist's protege asks his teacher, "How did you do that? In the dark, without any music?" The pianist reflects for a moment, and he says, "If you can't play in the darkness, you can't play in the light." My friends, we have lived for a very long time in the darkness of existential fear. Fear of an insidious virus that we cannot see, we cannot easily detect. It's out there, waiting to attack the vulnerable. And we are all vulnerable. We fear for our aging parents and elders. We fear for our partners and our dearest friends. We fear for ourselves, for our very lives. We fear for our children and our grandchildren. We've pushed the fear down, pushed it away, but it doesn't go away. Denial just kicks fear down the road. Ignoring it, we know, doesn't work, doesn't really keep it at bay. So what can we do? What can we do? Thankfully, the wisdom of the Jewish tradition has something to offer us. Something to offer us on this Rosh Hashanah. Essential sustenance during this time of need. It has to be noted that in our tradition, God instructs people about fear. Because a life dominated by fear is no life at all. As Rabbi Harold Kushner writes, fearful people cannot be happy. Fearful people cannot be generous, charitable, or forgiving. Fear constricts the soul and keeps us from being as fully human as God wants us to be. End quote. It's actually a mitzvah. It's a commandment. According to the great Jewish medieval philosopher Rambam, Maimonides, not to allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by fear. In the book of Deuteronomy, in Sefer Devarim, it says, Moses commands the people, saying, When you take the field against your enemies and see forces larger than yourselves, have no fear of them, for Adonai, your God, is with you. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them. Our teacher Rambam explains that these verses, which address the fear response in the extreme example of going to war, do not try to inhibit the feeling of fear. Nor do they mean that we can rely on God to rescue us miraculously. Rather, the commandment is not to allow that fear to cause us to run away from our enemies before the battle has even begun. Rambam explains that overcoming our fears such that we can squarely face the task ahead is what living with genuine faith means. So the antidote to fear is neither denial nor despair, but faith. It is, as Rabbi Kushner writes, to acknowledge that the world is a dangerous place and at the same time maintain that faith that God has planted within us the capacity to contend with those dangers and to overcome them. End quote. When I was a boy, growing up, my father was an orthodontist and made a very good living. I didn't know that we were wealthy because we never left our middle-class neighborhood, and my father still drove station wagons. One of the things that happened was that because of his wealth, my father was approached by businessmen looking for investors. The first few investments went incredibly well. And although, again, either me nor my siblings were aware of it at the time, our wealth grew enormously. My father was generous with his opportunities for success and involved family members and friends, and everyone was happy. I remember when an annual report arrived at the house and there were pictures of the members of the board of directors, ties and suits all spiffed up. And there was my Uncle Max from Detroit who drove a diaper delivery truck right there. And over here was my Uncle Rube from Rochester, New York, who was a factory clothing cutter. They were on the board. Their success went to their heads, and my father and his partners became arrogant and began playing fast and loose with the Security and Exchange Commission federal regulations. They were caught, and most of my father's partners went to federal prison. My father's lawyer convinced the judge that he didn't know what was going on, and he was spared the nightmare and indignity of incarceration. But that didn't stop an avalanche of civil lawsuits. My father's reputation as a philanthropist and a pillar of the Jewish community was destroyed. The lawsuits took everything. The year of my bar mitzvah, my father's orthodontist offices were sold in a sheriff's sale. Our cars were repossessed. The only reason we didn't lose our house was that early on it had been put in my mother's name. The stress level in my home was astronomical. My father was shunned, and my mother was devastated. Neighbors and friends who had once benefited and now lost money wouldn't let their children play with me and my siblings. It was so hard to understand what was going on. But there was great trauma. My own response was to go to work. I took on a 7-day-a-week paper route, getting up at 4 a.m. to deliver 140 papers every morning. As soon as I could, I got a job after school. My brothers and I worked summers in fabricating plants and heavy industry factories every year through high school. I used to give my mother money to buy groceries, and she cried every time she took it. It got so that I'd simply leave it on her dresser so she wouldn't have to be humiliated. My parents' marriage was a casualty of the financial collapse, although they stayed together long after there was any love between them. I'm not quite sure why. It's for another time, but somehow I never blamed my father and always felt sorry for his dramatic demise. I learned to work hard. My senior year in high school, I finished my classes by 9:30 a.m. and worked a full-time job from 10 to 6, while still delivering papers every morning before school. I did not take a penny from my parents from the time I was 13. I learned a lot about the challenges and privileges of being financially independent at a very young age. Believe me, I share this with you not to tell you that this was in any way a good thing. Trauma is never good. Me and my siblings grew up with the specter that no matter what we accomplished, it could go away at any minute. Each of us has had to work through the trauma that we experienced. Each of us had so much unpacking to do around financial vulnerability and the devastation of our parents' marriage. Trauma creates triggers, and those triggers are deep and can bring on regression when one least expects it. I share this very personal story with you today because so many of us have re-experienced trauma during this last year and a half. Many of our children have experienced it for the first time, from isolation and loss of social contacts to the challenge it posed to normal social development. I have talked to many people in this community, and a lot of folks, especially those with young children, have tried to put a happy face on the situation and have avoided talking about it. Children have wonderful antennae. And when there are difficult things happening and we as adults don't talk about it, the message they receive is that it is too scary to talk about. I'm not saying that we need to share all of our anxieties out loud, but we do need to put words to the stressful energy and tension everyone is feeling. We need to share our challenges with people we trust and share what we are learning together. The importance of communication and building greater trust during this challenging time is as important to us as a community as it is to each of our individual families and single members. Like everyone, everywhere, We have spent a lot of time this past year and a half in survival mode. We've been doing triage with community members whose extended family has struggled with the virus and its complex web of challenges. For so much of this time of COVID, we have had to be reactive. We put in our multi-camera streaming system so that we could offer services from our sanctuary. Like most synagogues and other faith communities, we had a learning curve on how to effectively use Zoom for our school last year, and for most of our programs. I spent an enormous time talking to our B'nai Mitzvah students about their challenges during COVID, and it was helpful to them and very meaningful to me. Most of my pastoral care focused on members who were alone or isolated. We need to create more opportunities to talk honestly together, to pool our experiences and help each other with our challenges. This time is a great test of who we can become as a community. This year we need to step up our game and create new structures that better respond to the needs of all of us. Please do not wait for the synagogue to take action. We are all the synagogue. We all share in the responsibility to more creatively respond to our situation. The question of how we continue to respond to this planetary pandemic is the legacy question of our time. In thinking about the role of faith during this time, I came across this lovely poem by Kim Rosen called "In Impossible Darkness." Please listen. Do you remember what happens inside a cocoon? You liquefy. There in the thick black of your self-spun womb, void as the moon before waxing, you melt, conceiving in impossible darkness the sheer inevitability of wings. Amen. This is a different way of thinking about darkness. Faith in times of uncertainty asks us to believe in a future that is unclear. While our tradition is completely focused on life, we live in the world as it is, but we are guided to behave as it ought to be. Ought to be. Our whole concept of tikkun olam is firmly situated in the present and looks hopefully toward a future time when our actions, through our actions, we can be a part of bringing the world to a place of greater peace and harmony. Our actions. You can argue a lot about what Judaism says about this or that, but at the very core of being Jewish is a bedrock belief that human beings have free will. We get to write our own stories. Nothing is decided ahead of time. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, may his memory be a blessing, writes, Western civilization is the product of two cultures, ancient Greece and ancient Israel. The Greeks believed in fate. The future is determined by the past. Jews believed in freedom. There is no evil decree that cannot be averted. The Greeks gave the world the concept of tragedy. Jews gave it the idea of hope. The whole of Judaism, though it would take a whole book to show it, is a set of laws and narratives designed to create in people, families, communities, and a nation habits that defeat despair. Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of mankind. End quote. The voice of hope in the conversation of mankind. Our legacy. So I want to come back to faith because I'm convinced that it is our healthiest and most powerful response to fear. Faith does not mean that we know everything's going to turn out all right. It is an assertion that we are more resilient than we ever imagined. As we gather today on Rosh Hashanah, the dawn of this new year, we can renew our faith. Our liturgy of these high holy days illuminates the nature of this faith, the divine presence that stands with us. We were just recited the Unetana Tokef, with its stirring passage that says, who will live and who will die? We don't know. We list almost everything possible that could go terribly wrong in the year ahead, every possible fate that might be waiting for us in this unfolding chapter of our lives: serenity or anxiety, ease or affliction, poverty or wealth, humiliation or exaltation. But the prayer doesn't end here, leaving us in despair. And it doesn't conclude by asking God to help us from our misfortune. No, rather we say, tshuva, tfilah, utzdaka, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. Choose to return to our essential nature. Strengthen our prayer field of empathy and realize that much wrongdoing can be mitigated and healed by genuine caring. This is not belief. This is faith. We do not know what the new year will bring. And we commit to doing the work, to invigorating our connection to others and to God, to taking practical action to help others. These are essential acts of faith. When we name our fears, we deprive them of some of their power. Then we can acknowledge the path of faith for overcoming fear. Our wisdom tradition helps us affirm life in the face of death and affirm faith in the face of fear. The deepest meaning of being a Jew is the conviction that we are strong enough to meet our fears head on. Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw was a great Hasidic teacher of the late 18th century. Many of us are familiar with the teaching, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzar me'od. All of the world is just a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to fear at all. Some of you have heard me teach that these words are a misquote. His actual teaching, found in his most famous work, Likutei Moharan, say, when a person must cross an exceedingly narrow bridge, the essential thing is not to frighten yourself at all. The words are not lo lefached, do not fear, but rather lo yitpached, which is a reflexive verb meaning do not make yourself afraid. Do not turn yourself into fear. not to fear at all. That's naive and impossible. Our spiritual task is to feel our fear, then cross the most difficult bridges of our lives with faith and courage and integrity. Ken Yiratzon, so may it be. Amen.